Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. We're on part 4 of our story tonight, and I'm so glad you've joined me. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with part 4 of our story tonight. We've got an old man called Clayton Harrington who's terribly confused and appears to want to follow a Bigfoot around, and he's been brought back safely home. So let's continue with our story tonight. I guess I must have made a considerable amount of noise when I entered Carol's house, failing abysmally at employing any circumspect discretion on my part, and as a consequence of the loud clattering sound I'd made, as I charged past the worn-out bureau in the entrance hall, which rattled precariously, and a vase of flowers was almost dismantled, so I quickly replaced them on the stand before they toppled over. I quickly made my way into the kitchen to prepare coffee, and then the drama began. I could hear Carol's dog Herbert yakking away. The little dog would not stop once he'd got started. Moments later I heard an urgent shuffle of fabric literally rubbing against the walnut floorboards. It sounded rather like a dressing gown. That was followed by light footsteps, and moments later a rather apprehensive-looking Carol appeared nervously in the kitchen. She was holding a baseball bat in her hands in a defensive position, with little Herbert by her side, glaring at me through his dark, furious eyes. He growled viciously at me, as if he thought I was an intruder. Carol looked as if she'd woken up. Just woken up, that is. Her eyelids were rather heavy, her hair slightly dishevelled. "Oh, thank God it's only you, Debbie. You gave me quite the shock. I heard an awful clanging noise, and then, of course, little Herbert here wouldn't stop, so I thought someone had broken into the house." "Oh, I'm very sorry, Carol," I said apologetically. "I didn't mean to wake you up, nor to scare you like this. Lathan warned me that you were a light sleeper, but I completely forgot to be discreet when I got back from my jaunt in the woods." "Heavens, dear, don't you dare apologize to me. You're a guest in this house, I'd like you to remember. I just thought I would investigate the noise, that's all. But I had no idea you'd be up and about so early in the morning. How very enterprising of you. We're usually all very late sleepers in this household, I'm afraid. So your having been in the woodgrove already is incredibly energetic of you. I am most impressed. I'm the kind of person that would lazily sleep in all day if given half the chance." "Well, I try to keep fit, Carol, but I could never work out in a gym, if you know what I mean. That would kill me with absolute boredom, running across a treadmill and staring at a blank piece of wall all the time. I just could never do that. So I get up early in the morning. I like the fresh air. But it's quite a morning I've had, Carol. It's like the whole morning has been—" "Been like what, dear? You've got me intrigued now. I must admit you look rather haunted, if you don't mind my saying so, as if you've had a bit of a shock of some kind." "That's a mild way to put it, Carol. But yes, I think you could say I've had a bit of a shock. I thought I was going to have a normal walk in the woodgrove this morning, but it was anything but. To tell you the truth, I'm a bit worried about your neighbour. You know, your neighbour across the way, that old man. Something's not right with him." "You mean Clayton Harrington? I didn't even know you knew him." "Well, that's right, that is his name. No, I don't know him, but I met him yesterday when we were bringing our luggage in that we'd left behind in the car. Your son introduced me to him. He looked a little spaced out, rather confused, and he was saying some weird stuff." "What kind of weird stuff was he saying?" "Well, he was talking about, something big, with big feet or something, being followed. I don't really know what he was saying, but none of it made any sense. Well, when I went for a walk this morning, I saw that the door of his house was wide open. I wasn't desperately concerned about him. I know you live in a safe neighbourhood, and the weather's been seasonably warm of late, but I thought I'd look in on him on the way back. I thought that perhaps he was scatterbrained and forgot to close the door behind him. Anyway, when I went for a walk in the grove, I got the shock of my life, Carol, because Mr. Harrington was in the grove, wandering around the place, looking, kind of out of sorts, so to speak. Let me get this right, my dear. Are you telling me that Clayton Harrington was wandering around the woodgrove at this time of the morning? Goodness gracious me, I can hardly believe it. I'm afraid he was. I didn't want to tell Carol about the Bigfoot, lest she thought her future daughter-in-law was as mad as a March hare. So I told her what I'd observed, minus the Bigfoot encounter, of course. I shrugged my shoulders nonchalantly. Well, he appeared to be mumbling to himself. He was rather disorientated. I tried to persuade him to go back home. He didn't want to leave the grove. At one point I introduced myself to him. He got his wires crossed, and he thought I was you. He started complaining that Lathan was riding over his flower beds with his bicycle, destroying his precious foxgloves. He also complained that Lathan had thrown a ball at his yard shed, and subsequently broken a window. He seemed to believe that Lathan was only 10 years old again. It was like he had gone back in time. It was seriously bizarre. I've never seen anything like it. I didn't even know old people could do that, when they became delusional. How extraordinary! I thought something wasn't right with him last week, when I was speaking to him. At first he barked at me, was incredibly rude. It was like he didn't know who on earth I was. And he seemed to bounce back to the Mr. Harrington I knew and loved again. He was behaving as he always did in the past. So I didn't think any more about it. I brushed it under the carpet. He was asking me how I was. It was a very convivial conversation, I told him that Lathan was engaged to a lovely lady called Debbie Whitechapel. I told him all about you, He seemed most interested. And he was very happy for Lathan to have found such a lovely young lady like yourself. He was saying how only the other day Lathan had been a little boy, getting up to all kinds of mischief. For a moment I even wondered if the former part of our conversation had occurred at all, as if it had all been in my imagination. When we chatted together, he just seemed to be all there. I hope, my dear, given he was in the woodgrove on his own this morning, that you did manage to persuade him to go home. The poor man can't be wandering around the grove if he's losing his mind, especially at this time of the morning. The man's absolutely incorrigible. What are we going to do about him? I did help him get home, as it happens, but he put up quite a resistance, I'm afraid. It was rather like dragging a kid away from a fairground and saying no, they couldn't have the candy floss. He was literally fighting back belligerently. He was behaving like a naughty kid. I used a bit of artistic license, I'm afraid. I told him he'd better get back to his house so that Lathan could pay him for the damages to his shed window. That seemed to inspire him to leave the grove. Money seems to have a magical allure to get people to do what you want them to do, doesn't it? Even in a confused state, I hasten to say. In saying that, I doubt Mr. Harrington is short of a bob or two. I noticed he had expensive pieces of furniture in his house. When I got him into his house, I made him coffee and some breakfast. He started calling me Ginger, telling me he preferred it when my hair was auburn, and that my brown hair was not a very nice colour. I think he called it nondescript. He kept saying, what did I think I was doing dyeing my perfectly beautiful hair such an ugly colour? Carol shook her head sadly. Don't take any notice of him, dear. Your hair is perfectly lovely. It's a beautiful colour. Ginger was his wife. He was married to her over 30 years ago. But his wife died of a brain hemorrhage. He was never the same, after she died. She had auburn hair. He loved that hair so much. He'd never have approved of his wife dyeing her hair brown. So if he thought you were his wife with brown hair, he wouldn't be best pleased about that. He would get upset, even if she attempted to change her hairstyle. So his behaviour towards you makes perfect sense to me. If he believed you were his beloved wife, Ginger, and it seems that he did. Well, I think he did. It was really embarrassing, Carol. He kept giving me sloppy kisses on my cheek, telling me how much he loved me, but how he hated my new hair. Well, Clayton's a little eccentric, my dear. Very set in his ways, he is. He's lived on his own for a long time, and always been quite cantankerous. He likes to keep himself to himself. It was really good of you, Debbie, to make him breakfast for him, given you don't know the man at all. So tell me, did he settle down after you gave it to him? I do hope so. We can't have him gallivanting around the woodgrove like that." "Well, I'm glad to say, Carol, he did. Mr. Harrington thankfully passed out on the sofa in the living room. The poor man was exhausted. Judging by his dishevelled state, I think he might have been wandering around in the grove all night, but I can't be sure about that. He had dirt all over his clothes, and there were leaves in his hair." "Goodness gracious me," said Carol, shaking her head sorrowfully again. "Poor old Clayton. He really is losing his mind, isn't he? I mean, that incident with the yard shed. It happened eons ago, you know. We did replace the broken window for him. My bet is if you went over there now to pay for the so-called broken yard shed window, he wouldn't know what on earth you were talking about. I suspect his mind is jumping around the place like a frog on steroids, and is confusing the past with the present, and he's jumbled them up together, so he can't see the woods for the trees. Poor man. What are you going to do about this, Carol? I mean, I know it's none of my business, but Mr. Harrington clearly needs some help. He's not all there. He could be a danger to himself." Carol sighed. "You're right. I'm going to have to make the phone call that I was dreading to have to make. But I have no choice in the matter now." "Who are you going to phone? His relatives?" "No, I'm going to phone a nephew of his in Juneau, Alaska. Unfortunately, other members of Clayton Harrington's family have distanced themselves from him over the years. You know what families are like, how people fall out all the time. Clayton Harrington, well, when he was younger, could be rather prickly, rub people up the wrong way. He still does, you know, which was one of the reasons he soured his relationship with his extended family. Even his own brothers have been estranged from him for years. It's desperately sad. I mean, he's always been quite a hermit since Ginger died. But I know his nephew will make a plan. Maybe organize a full-time carer to move in with him, to take care of the man." "It is sad," I agreed. "I know, but we must remember age will afflict us all one day. I'm not getting any younger myself. Shall I make you some coffee, love, before I make that phone call? And how about something for breakfast?" "That would be lovely. A coffee and a piece of toast is more than enough for me, Carol. I'm not a big eater this early in the morning." "Which explains why, my dear, you have such a lovely figure. I was so worried about meeting you. But I have to tell you, my next-door neighbour was right. She told me that I was bound to love you to pieces, as Lathan is such a good judge of character. And it seems she was not wrong." "Ooh, something smells nice," said my fiancé, entering the kitchen, wearing shorts and a T-shirt, his hair ruffled, his eyes half open. "You're smelling the toast I'm making for Debbie," said Carol. "Would you like some, love? Or something more substantial, perhaps? Eggs and bacon? I'm quite happy to fry some up for you." "Toast will be just fine, Mum. I'm not very hungry," said Lathan appreciatively, taking a seat at the kitchen table next to me. "I was just saying, my dear, to your Debbie over here, how wonderful it is to finally meet her. And how glad I am that she's now part of our family. We were having a little tete-a-tete, talking about, you know, old Mr. Harrington from across the road." "What about him?" asked Lathan, raising a quizzical brow. "Was Debbie telling you about what happened yesterday, when we bumped into him?" "I don't think he knew who I was, Mum. He was saying some very weird stuff about big feet and about being followed. I couldn't understand what he was going on about. It was bizarre. It was like he was looking right through us and didn't even see us physically standing there." "Yes, she told me all about your strange interaction. I'm afraid, love, it's time for me to call his nephew in Juneau. Clayton Harrington is no longer capable of looking after himself. It's plain to see." "But are you sure, Mum?" "I'm afraid so, love. There is no doubt. Debbie discovered him wandering around the woodgrove this morning. He was behaving very childishly. He didn't want to go home. I interceded. He thought I was your mother, I'm afraid." He was complaining about a yard shed that you broke when you were 10 years old. Can you believe that?
That is not good news. Yes, I thought something was off about him yesterday, Clayton agreed. If he's like that, we really are going to have to call his nephew in Juneau. He cannot possibly stay in that house unsupervised without any help. He'll be a danger to himself.
Moments later, after Carol had made the much-needed phone call, she looked up at me and Lathan with a resolute expression on her face. I've done it, finally. So what did his nephew say? I asked. Well, unfortunately, he can't fly out here right away. He can only come here next week. He asked me to try and get a carer to move in with his uncle right away. He's willing to cover all the expenses and costs. He was grievously concerned about his uncle's strange behaviour, and how you, Debbie, saw him wandering around the grove this morning, mumbling to himself. He believes that if we take Clayton to a care home of some kind, that the man is going to kick up quite the fuss and refuse to go. And I agree with him wholeheartedly on that. The best option is to have someone staying on the property with him to take care of him. Clayton is fiercely independent, you see. He's always insisted in staying at that home. He told me he was going to die there, and that is that. He's got a couple of spare rooms in that property that will be suitable for the carer to stay in. Carol soon made some phone calls, and before long we organised a carer for Clayton. The woman was in her early 30s, and assured us she was very experienced and had worked with people who had Alzheimer's disease and dementia. We felt reasonably satisfied that she was experienced enough. When we arrived at Clayton Harrington's house to introduce him to the new carer, he appeared to be in good form, and was as sharp as a hawk. I remember thinking to myself that this is not the same man that I'd seen wandering around the wood grove, for he appeared so lucid.
Goodness gracious me! If it isn't Carol Huberger! This is a lovely surprise. It's very good to see you, Carol. And who do we have here? He said, glancing at me and the carer. He gave us all a warm, sunny smile, and looked at me as if he'd never seen me a day in his life, with an inquiring gaze. Clayton Harrington appeared to have enjoyed a shave and a shower that morning. He was smartly attired, in chinos and a cool, crisp cotton shirt. There was nothing untoward about him that would suggest he was remotely senile. Even the carer, who was wearing a smart navy blue uniform, looked a tad surprised by Clayton's demeanour. I couldn't help but think she probably wondered what all the fuss was about, as this elderly man, that she was supposed to care for, looked to be of sound mind. It's such a surprise, as I was saying, Carol, to see you, said Clayton. It's been a long time, hasn't it? Are you going to introduce me to your lovely friends?
Carol flushed red with embarrassment. I don't know if you've met Debbie Whitechapel. She's the young lady that I was telling you about. The lovely lady that is going to marry my son Lathan. Don't you remember? I was so surprised that there really was no recognition in Clayton Harrington's eyes. He took my hand in his, shaking it vigorously.
It's very good to meet you, Debbie Whitechapel. Lathan has done very well for himself indeed. You're very easy on the eye. I'm sure he's a very lucky man. And who is this young lady? Asked Clayton, looking at the carer. Lathan is not marrying two women, is he? He asked teasingly.
Carol flushed red with embarrassment. I don't know if you remember that I was telling you that my son's met a lovely young lady. This is Debbie Whitechapel. She's the lady that is going to marry Lathan. She's my new daughter-in-law.
Oh, yes, I seem to remember you telling me all about her. Whitechapel. Very interesting surname, I have to say. And it is delightful to meet you, Debbie.
I was surprised that there was absolutely no recognition in Clayton Harrington's eyes. He took my hand in his and shook it vigorously.
As I was saying, it's very good to meet you, Debbie. Lathan has done very well for himself, I have to say. You're easy on the eye. And who is this other young lady? Asked Clayton, looking inquiringly at the carer. Lathan is not marrying two, woman, is he? He asked teasingly. Carol was looking rather awkward. Of course not, Clayton. As if my Lathan would ever do that. He's a one-woman man, and Debbie is all he wants. If you must know, this young lady here is called Cassie, Clayton. Your nephew has organized for Cassie to stay here with you for a while, to help you manage the house. Stuff like that, if you know what I mean. Clayton Harrington looked taken aback. He raised his brow. But why would Levi hire someone to look after me? I'm perfectly capable of looking after myself, you know. Of course you are, Clayton. No one can disagree with that. It's just that Levi thought you should have someone help you spring clean your house, cook you a few nice meals. He says it's a gift from him to you, so to speak. But why? It's not my birthday. I think Levi misses you a lot. You know what he's like. He wanted to do something nice for you. So why not let him, Clayton? It's his privilege. He's obviously making money and he just wanted to spoil you a bit. That's all. Well, I suppose you better come in then, Cassie, said Mr. Harrington reluctantly. You might want to make a start on washing the curtains in the living room. They've been looking quite dowdy recently. Cassie made a rather contorted, rather disapproving face. She knew she was not here to spring clean Clayton Harrington's house, but she seemed to fully understand the sensitivity of the awkward situation. So she gritted her teeth and gave the man a watery smile and said, Well, I better get on with it, hadn't I? Me and my fiancé decided to stretch out our stay with Carol, beyond just a long weekend, as Lathan wanted to help her with sorting out the problem she had with Clayton Harrington, and I for one was glad to be staying a little longer. It would be the quintessential opportunity to get to know my mother-in-law better. Well, my future mother-in-law, that is. The following 2 days went rather well, although Cassie was telling us that there were times Mr. Harrington thought she was his wife Ginger, but she humoured him and went along with the charade. It was on the 4th night of my stay at Carol's house that me and Lathan woke up with a start. We could hear someone banging noisily on Carol's front door. Lathan and I hurled ourselves out of bed like two rockets in take-off and hurried towards the front door. Lathan opened the door to a terrified-looking Cassie. She was out of breath, and for a brief moment nothing appeared to come out of her mouth, as if she'd simply lost the ability to speak. Her body was wobbling like a jelly, her face as white as a sheet. Lathan led her into the kitchen, insisting she take a seat, while he prepared her a measure of whiskey. "What's going on?" asked Carol, who had heard the commotion and come rushing into the kitchen, with Herbert cradled in her arms. "What on earth is going on? What was the awful commotion about?" Her eyes trailed over Cassie. "Is everything all right, Cassie? What on earth is going on? You look quite shaken, my dear. Your face is as white as a sheet. Are you all right?" Cassie was talking so fast, it was hard to make out what she was saying. I've never been so scared, Mrs. Huberger. You've no idea. It was staring at me through the window. I can't possibly go back in that house. I'm sorry, I just can't. There's no way I'm going back into that house. Calm down, Cassie, said Carol, putting a reassuring, comforting arm around the woman's back and tapping it gently. What on earth is going on, dear? I saw it, Mrs. Huberger. I saw it clearly. The moonlight lit the creature up. I could see him through the living room window, staring in at us. Oh, I've never been so terrified, Mrs. Huberger. You have no idea how big this thing was. When I say big, you have no idea. You have no idea. Sorry, Cassie. What were you seeing staring at you through the window? Could you explain yourself a little better, perhaps? You've completely lost me, my dear. It was a Bigfoot, Mrs. Huberger. A Bigfoot. I don't know how to tell you this, Mrs. Huberger, but it gets worse because I couldn't stop him. Believe me, I tried to stop him. I tried, Mrs. Huberger. I knew it wasn't safe to go out of doors with that thing out there. But Mr. Harrington, he wouldn't listen to me. He ran out of the door, Mrs. Huberger, after the Bigfoot. Oh, I'm so sorry, but that thing is going to kill him. What are we going to do, Mrs. Huberger? Let's get this right, my dear. Now, I just want you to calm down. You saw a Bigfoot looking at you through the living room window. Is that right? Are you sure that that is what you were seeing? Could you not have been a little mistaken? Seen a shadow, perhaps? It's easy to happen, you know. I promise you, Mrs. Huberger, there is no mistake. I saw a male Bigfoot. I know it was a male. I just know. Don't ask me how I know. I just know. I need to ask you this, Cassie. Now, don't take offence to what I'm asking you, but have you been drinking on the job? No, of course not, Mrs. Huberger. I never ever drink. I know you must think I sound crazy, but I saw a Bigfoot. I'm not lying. And Mr. Harrington went after him. I'm worried about him, Mrs. Huberger. I couldn't stop him. He just bolted out of the door. It's going to kill him. I know it is. Oh, my God, it's so dangerous. What are we going to do? She probably did see a Bigfoot, I said so matter-of-factly that everybody turned around to look straight at me, as if I was speaking a foreign language. Well, I've seen the Bigfoot myself, so I assure you Cassie is not making this up. She probably did see a male Bigfoot. He is a male. Lathan looked at me incredulously, his jaw dropping wide open, his eyes widening. You've seen a Bigfoot? You didn't think to tell me about this? Well, I thought you'd think I was as mad as a March hare. I did see him in the woodgrove, 3 mornings ago, actually, if you must know. But he is completely harmless. He's not harmless, cried Cassie, her eyes growing wide with indignation. You mark my words. That thing is a killing machine. It's got to be. I assure you that Bigfoot is totally harmless. He looks very scary and intimidating, but I promise you he wouldn't harm a fly. I was terrified when I first encountered him myself, but believe it or not, he's benevolent. He was trying to help old Mr. Harrington back to his home. The Bigfoot was telling me that Mr. Harrington was very confused, that he was drifting between the astral world and our reality. He told me it was because he's not long for this earth. I think the Bigfoot has extrasensory perception. Carol was looking at me with an aghast expression on her face. You're telling me that the Bigfoot spoke to you? Is that what you're saying? How is that remotely possible? I nodded. Carol, he spoke to me in a foreign language. I didn't understand what he was saying at first, but I promise you, suddenly every word made sense. It was like it was almost downloaded into my head, and I understood exactly what he was saying. The creature was only standing 2 feet away from me. He had the kindest eyes you've ever seen. If he wanted to harm me, he could have done so easily, without any problems, but he didn't. The trouble is he's such an intimidating-looking creature, your natural reaction is to be terribly afraid. But I promise you, he was just such an easy-going creature. Mr. Harrington is safe, but we should probably go after him, because he's very disorientated and confused, and I suspect the Bigfoot was just checking up on him. I don't care if that creature is benevolent or not, as you say. I'm still not going anywhere near those woods. The size of that thing. It was an absolute monster. The most intimidating thing I've ever seen. And I'm sorry, I still believe he's dangerous. Well, I'll go and get Mr. Harrington, I said. You can't go after him, said Lathan. It's dangerous. No, it's not, I said, screwing up my face. I told you, the Bigfoot's absolutely harmless. I encountered the creature. I stood 2 feet away from him. I was telling you that. If he wanted to harm me, he could have done so, but he didn't. Lathan did not look convinced, and insisted on arming himself with his late father's rifle, but we both went into the woodgrove together after Mr. Harrington. It was a dark, inauspicious night, but thankfully both me and Lathan
were wearing flashlights on our heads so we could see relatively well.
"I hope you know what you're doing, Debbie," said Lathan. "I feel very uneasy about all of this."
"Everything will be absolutely fine," I assured him. But Lathan continued to look unconvinced. His hands were trembling on his rifle. I don't think he relished the prospect of an encounter with a Bigfoot. We ambled down the path and could hear a conversation taking place, and when the light of Lathan's torch illuminated the Bigfoot that was talking to Mr. Harrington, Lathan shrank back in horror, terror etched on his face. We could hear Mr. Lathan saying,
"What do you mean by saying goodbye? I want to come with you."
When the Bigfoot saw me, there was relief on his face. Lathan froze to the spot as the Bigfoot moved towards us. But Lathan thankfully stood his ground.
"Kila kikwasi, ha kilaniko, hatilani kasapani, hoshaki sakwa." "I'm very glad you've come. Do you think you can get the man back to his house? I'm afraid when he saw me at the window, he came out after me. That was not my intention. I just came to say goodbye. He is departing from the earth plane tomorrow. I came to bid him farewell. His time on this earth is over."
"But how could you possibly know this?" I asked. "How can you tell?"
"Well, his energy has changed, hasn't it? He's wearing that green colour on his body. It's becoming increasingly subdued, growing fainter and fainter. It means his time is almost up."
Lathan didn't say anything to the Bigfoot, but I knew by his body language that he had understood the Bigfoot's every word. He was breathing more easily, as if he was more comfortable in the Bigfoot's company. The Bigfoot had seen his rifle, but did not react to it negatively. Instead, he said,
"Kila kwasa, don't be afraid of me, man. There are monsters out there you need to be fearful of. Some of them are of your own kind, but let me assure you, I am not one of them. Kila tina kwasinaka, hila tila nopo." Sometimes the scariest things, I'm afraid, are wrapped up in the most benign parcels. Hila kinakwa, hoshaki salakati lanako, ha kilaniba. I might look intimidating, but I'm a pussycat, really.
All Lathan could do was nod, as if he understood the meaning of the Bigfoot's words. "Don't worry," I told him. "We'll get Mr. Harrington back to the house."
"Iman tilaki. I'm much obliged," said the Bigfoot. "I probably should not have come to say goodbye, kila tila puno. But I've grown rather fond of the old man. It seemed wrong not to wish him all the best. But he's awfully confused. He's going to a very happy place, you know, much better than here. And his wife is waiting for him."
We watched the Bigfoot gliding into the woods, and Lathan looked at me with bright gleaming eyes.
"Well, I never. I've seen everything now," he said.
It was quite a performance getting Mr. Harrington to go back to his house. Once again he had absolutely no clue who I was. He didn't appear to recognize Lathan either, but I told him we needed to hurry back to his house, and he made quite a scene about it, as if he was still hankering after the Bigfoot. He kept saying he didn't want to go home. Even Lathan was surprised by Clayton Harrington's juvenile antics. I cunningly told the old man that he needed to hurry home at once, as Lathan Huberger was going to pay for the repairs to his yard shed window.
"About time, too. What's wrong with the boy? That bill has been outstanding for quite some time."
We led Lathan Harrington back home. I prepared him some tea and toast, while the old man fell asleep on the sofa. But when I tried to rouse him, I realized he'd passed away. He looked incredibly peaceful, and I realized the Bigfoot really had come to say goodbye to the old man, as it was Mr. Harrington's time to go. I marvelled that the Bigfoot knew this. I walked away from Mr. Harrington's house, filled with an incredible sense of peace. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Loved every minute of it. Thank you very much. Until next time, goodbye and good night.